I get very frustrated when people take heritage to be too precious, because I think buildings should and can evolve. And I think we need to always be looking at them with fresh eyes and not looking at them as preserved an aspect. In fact, I'm most excited by subverting and changing existing things.
Welcome to Things I've Learned, the podcast in which we explore how the inner worlds of designers, architects, and creatives shape the world around us, by asking them to reflect on success, failure, and of course, design itself. I'm McKinley. There's nothing new under the sun, as the line goes. It's the kind of phrase people throw around to suggest that originality is a myth. And maybe, in a way, it is. But here's the thing. Just because ideas aren't brand new doesn't mean they can't feel new. Creativity has perhaps always been less about inventing from scratch and more about remixing, reimagining, and reframing. Think about it. Songs sample other songs. Novels echo allegories that are thousands of years old. Businesses repackage old ideas with new tech. What matters isn't whether the seed is ancient, it's how it's planted in the present. Last season, Studio Appetit's Ido Guarini explained that, for him, the key to creating captivating experiences is giving us something familiar in an unfamiliar way, delivering the comfort of recognition and a jolt of surprise at the same time. When it comes to design, then, every table, logo, or building carries a trace of what came before it. But the designer's role is arguably to twist the kaleidoscope just enough that the pattern feels fresh again. This episode will ask if it's ever really possible to create something from nothing, or if originality is about seeing the old with new eyes. As I'm joined by Julian de Metz, founding director of multi-award-winning architecture practice dMFK. He's a third-generation architect who trained with Moshe Safdie and Orms, and his design philosophy strongly emphasizes human experience, sensitivity to heritage buildings, and evolution rather than pure restoration. He speaks of reinventing and altering existing buildings fearlessly. Welcome to Things I've Learned, Julian. Tell me, do you consider your work original?
Do I consider our work original? No, I don't think there is any such thing as a completely new original idea, particularly in the area that we work in, which is mainly retrofit and reimagining of existing buildings. I think that a lot of what we're doing is editing, finding things that work and stripping away the things that don't work, and then recontextualizing things that were seen or maybe invented for one thing, that are being repositioned for a completely different thing. And that can be as simple as the change of use of a room, or it could be the change of use of an entire building. And so something that was previously considered to be a working building becomes a leisure building, for example, and stripping away the things that have become irrelevant or don't work for their new use. And when we're looking at existing buildings, the ones we enjoy the most are the ones where we can change them the most, or where we can subvert the original use. So in some sense, it's an original approach to something that's been in existence for a very long time.
Transformative, perhaps, more than original.
Yes. I mean, there was always a thing in heritage, where anything new should contrast against the old. And we don't really take that view. For my part, I really enjoy looking for the good in a building. So we've refurbished some really beautiful modernist buildings, and that period of architecture really did fall out of favour. We refurbished the Basil Spence building, and then some sort of non-name architect buildings as well. And when you look around them, then you realise that person at that time put a lot of love and skill into that building, and there are beautiful things that have perhaps gone to sleep or been lost. And from my perspective, I like to try and get into the head of the original architect. So what if I gave you that job again in today's environment? What would you do differently? How would you approach the same problem again? So it's sort of trying to empathize with the original architect and evolve their story, because no architect would disagree that buildings are living things that evolve and change over time as our culture changes. And I think that heritage protection has quite a lot to answer for in terms of sometimes stifling that evolution.
Well, your perspective has worked for you. You've got an incredibly accomplished studio, and we're going to talk a bit more about that success in just a moment. But first, a message. Finding a quiet place at work for a private meeting or deep focused work shouldn't feel like navigating Piccadilly Circus. Bureau builds modular booths that aren't just privacy pods. They're flexible, high-performing environments designed for deep focus, quick calls, or team huddles, built from sustainable materials, flat-packed for low-impact shipping, and crafted to last. From co-working floors to corporate offices and beyond, Bureau creates workspaces that, well, work. And with a human team guiding you from first quote to final install, change is refreshingly straightforward. See what's possible at withbureau.com. Julian, how do you define success?
If I am successful, which I'm one of those people that never quite believes it, even if other people tell me it's true, then other people recognizing or people enjoying your buildings and telling you that they're enjoying them, people wandering into your buildings and not really understanding why they love them or why they're enjoying them, but just saying it just feels great in here, altering people's experience of their day, lifting their experience through environment is extraordinarily satisfying. And I'd say that's one of the biggest sort of vindications of what we do. Even from a very, very young age, I was very aware that architecture could have that effect on you. So I remember being dragged around Brent Cross with my mum and thinking, this building has the potential to make me feel sad. But I grew up in a house. My dad was an architect. My granddad was an architect. And I remember we lived in this little house and he used to do this thing of when he made a bit of more money, he would extend the house. I remember one day him taking a sledgehammer and saying, kids, look at this, and smashed a hole in the wall. And then this new room appeared. And suddenly my whole perspective on the room that I knew very well was completely changed. And it was extraordinarily exhilarating. And that feeling is something that I enjoy in my daily life all the time. I mean, I think that using space to change your everyday experience and create surprise and exhilaration and freshness feels very exciting to me. And when people recognize that, that feels like some version of success.
So being a third generation architect, what did you learn from your family about success?
It's complicated. My granddad, they were Jewish immigrants with nothing. Success to them was being part of the establishment, being very British, being a Mason, my granddad, and that was success to him, and sort of moving in certain circles that he felt that he wasn't welcome in. Whereas my dad didn't really care about that at all. He just cared about getting the wind in his hair, about using buildings to create amazing experiences. And he was much less kind of concerned with society. And so I sort of balance up those two different positions. One, which is about respect in the architectural community, which I can't lie, it's nice to have. And I always sort of felt, well, you know, I'm not a proper architect. You know, the architectural community will never recognize me or be quite sort of insecure about that. And then on the other hand, my dad, who just couldn't care less, and sort of balance up those two things. And I think that's really nice. In the wash, I probably side with my dad.
Well, you said that you don't always believe it when people tell you you're successful. Do you think they would see you as successful? What would they make of the architect that you've become? I'm
starting to accept that they might be right in the same way that I'm starting to accept that from my wife that I'm all right. So I think that we, through graft and through real care, try to craft proper spaces and proper buildings that feel enduring and feel honest and authentic, and that respect the buildings that we're working on. And I think in doing that, people are starting to recognize that our practice is a very safe pair of hands. We work our buildings very hard. We look into every single corner. We're very tenacious in terms of not just saying, well, that's just the way it's done. In fact, we get more joy out of saying, well, if that's the way it's done, we don't want to do it like that. How do we actually want to feel in this building? And that's what guides our decision-making process. So quite often we end up with solutions that are sort of more experiential than formal.
But of course, before dMFK, you went into practice with your father. Did you learn anything there about achieving success collaboratively?
Well, actually, you know what? The sort of professional side of working together with a family member is something that some people can do very well, and other people like me cannot, and I needed to separate those two things completely. But in doing that and in starting to really think about some of the things we're talking about today, I was talking about how buildings and spaces and your environment can make you feel. I very much took that from my father, but it was more from actually my upbringing than from attempting to work with him. Plus, my dad didn't really want to run a straightforward architecture practice. He wanted to buy buildings and develop. And I realized actually as a person, I'm a much more natural problem solver for other people. I'm more of a natural kind of servant. And I think that is part of the job of being a designer or an architect too. Architects is looking at other people's, being very nosy and looking at other people's problems and trying to solve them. One day I might be designing a livery hall. Another day I might be designing someone's home, an office scheme or something civic. And we do quite a lot of religious buildings as well. And I really enjoy poking my nose into lots of different types of people and communities. And that is one of the joys of what we do.
What was your first taste of success as an individual? Did you learn anything from that?
I think my first taste of success as an individual was just working away from my dad. There was a period when we first started working and it was coming out of the late 1980s recession, where there were a lot of commercial buildings that were vacant. And myself and one other person, probably in the first year of working together, converted about 20 of these into lofts, they would have called them in those days. And we just started getting an enormous return rate from clients and people come back to us and enjoying the way that we approach those existing buildings. And I think just being acknowledged in that way, the AJ were very supportive at that time and they were publishing these projects that we were doing, and we were only in our kind of late 20s and just into practice. And then we won the 40 under 40 or were nominated for the 40 under 40. And that's when I thought, okay, maybe.
Everyone has an opinion on architecture, though. It is the very fabric of our built environment. So who decides if a building is a failure or a success?
I would describe our practices as we're a design-led commercial practice. So I don't pretend that what we do is not commercial. We make money for our clients, and those buildings, the money that is made obviously makes profit for those clients, but also facilitates the restoration of those buildings in many, many cases. So probably the biggest marker of success is that building full? And most of the time, people love our buildings and they fill. And we are very, very market focused. I would never do anything that was sort of purely aesthetic. It's always doing stuff that improves human experience and creates the maximum chance of that building being full, because full buildings are being used and they turn a profit for our clients, which is super important.
Well, you've worked alongside some real titans of architecture. Moshe Safdie, I mentioned at the top, he's a personal favorite of mine, partly because of his ability to take classic, even ancient design language and remix it for today. What lessons have you gleaned perhaps from some of those mentors or collaborators about being a successful architect?
It's really interesting. I mean, some people talk a lot and they don't say very much. And some people don't talk very much and you can get something out of them that stays with you for life. And I was with Moshe Safdie for a year. I lived in Boston for my part one, which is the bit after your first 3 years of architecture school. And he was just a very, very shrewd communicator and extremely good on potting ideas in sentences or in sketches. I was always very insecure about drawing, and I thought that in order to be a good architect, you had to be able to draw beautifully. And Moshe could draw very beautifully, but actually what he was really good at was simple drawings that communicated an enormous amount. And so I went to a couple of lectures when I was there. He described Habitat, one of the projects that was one of his seminal buildings, described it in 2 sentences and was incredibly accurate with the nature of an idea. And then after that, I went back to university, and my tutor was David Green, a man called David Green, and he articulated to me that a good idea, I think you remember him drawing a rectangle inside a rectangle, an irregular shape inside a rectangle, and a rectangle inside an irregular shape, and then 2 irregular shapes. And he described one as banal, one as insanity, and 2 as quite good ideas. And the ability to communicate simple design ideas like that is central to what we do now. And it's super, super important.
Well, you mentioned that simplicity informing the work that you do today. So what have been some of those key successes for your own studio, and what have you perhaps learned from them?
Obviously, we've done a succession of larger, more interesting projects. We developed a relationship with a company called The Office Group quite early. We did the first building that they ever did, and then probably did more buildings for The Office Group than any other architect had done. And so our relationship and our continued relationship with The Office Group is something that I'm extremely proud of. And I think the way that the flex office market has kind of actually set the agenda for what modern office design is now like, I think it is something that we and they were a part of and developed. And the last building that we did with them before things changed at The Office Group was a building called Chancery House, which I think combines the essence of all of the things that we worked on over many years. So I sort of look at that project and I think that is a great success. I think it has evolved the story of how we all work. And then as a result of that, we've won some lovely awards,
several awards, I believe.
Thank you very much. And we were Building Design Office Architect of the Year last year, which I would never have expected, but it sort of felt like real validation of what we've been doing, which has quite often been looked at as the sort of broad cousin of end user office design.
Well, I think it was very well deserved. I'm going to give you a challenge now. So you said there's a certain skill in condensing ideas into just a line or two. So in just a line or two, before we move on to our next chapter, what does success look like next? What are you still reaching for?
I just think that taking the way we approach our buildings and applying it to much more complicated problems, I think we're ready for that.
So we have covered the positives. Next, we're going to move into slightly choppier waters as we discuss failure. But first, a brief message. Mix Interiors is the leading platform for commercial interior design and architecture, in print and online. We feature the people shaping and reshaping the world around us, explore the latest projects setting the bar for exceptional design, and showcase the products at the very forefront of innovation and creativity. For more information on how to subscribe in print or to view the latest digital content, head to mixinteriors.com. Julian, can you remember the first time that you experienced failure, and what did it teach you?
I don't really think that way. I have a kind of very optimistic view of life generally, that things don't happen for a reason. So, for example, I found a wonderful house that I thought was my dream house or our dream house, and then it fall through. But I've almost consistently conclude, looking back over life, that the thing that came next is always better than the thing that you lost. So I don't really look at those things as failures. And sometimes we've come up with ideas for beautiful buildings or materials that we can use and then get kiboshed because of cost or not be able to get that material and end up having to do something different and it always be better. So I sort of find that kind of failure or things not working as just a step on the journey to finding a better solution. It isn't always. I mean, I was reading this book about Grenfell at the moment called Show Me the Bodies. I don't know if you read it. But, that was a scenario where they started off with something that was right. And then through meanness and subterfuge and greediness and all those things, the thing got changed to something worse. And that worse thing was the thing that killed all these people. That is an example where things changing doesn't end up in something better. So you always got to have a mind to making things as good as they can be. So seeing things that don't work as opportunities. But I think generally in the world of architecture, failure would be watching something that you did quite recently be replaced. Obviously, some of the earlier projects we did were less good and they've probably been ripped out. And that's a shame. But I mean, that is what we aim for now, is to every product we put in, every surface, to do stuff that's authentic and enduring, and also find furniture, for example, that's solid material and that once we're gone will be passed on to somebody else and they'll reuse it or continue it into its next life.
You mentioned some of that early work that is perhaps less good, but can you think of a specific project that failed in some way, and did it teach you anything? No,
they're all really good. I mean, you try to do interesting things, and sometimes you combine materials or bring things together or use innovative products that turn out not to be as innovative as you thought. I've been very lucky in that those sorts of errors that we might have made have been largely aesthetic and not more profound, as the building industry has devastatingly shown in the last few years. So, yes, I mean, we've certainly tried things that haven't worked over the years, but generally speaking, no, I think the attitude that we have now is the attitude that we've always had, and we've tried to apply it.
Well, it's a great attitude then, and also potentially a pretty great record if you feel that you haven't had any projects that have failed. There must be a certain skill within that. So what has perhaps allowed you to avoid failure when you've come up against some of those challenges? How have you managed to navigate them?
I think we just go about each project, treat it in isolation, and try to earnestly and honestly do the best by that client and that building at that time, and really put our heart and soul into it. I think as we get better briefs and better budgets and better buildings to work on, our chances of failure are less. But sometimes also we come into buildings, certain things don't work, and they're adjusted or edited. So it's not through the in-use process.
Have you learnt anything from others about navigating failure?
Probably. I mean, they're great questions. I think I might have just written them out of my mind. I'm terrified of failure. Yeah, I think that whatever the problem is and whatever has messed up, there's always a solution. Unless you die, apart from that, all problems are solvable. And so we don't worry too much about things not going right.
I mean, it's interesting that you say you're terrified of failure, because actually across this show, others see failure very much as part of the process, as a learning curve, a stepping stone to go on to find solutions. Do you think we talk about failure enough as a design industry to perhaps recontextualize it, not as something to be scared of, but as something that has value in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's just a language thing that we're talking about here. I mean, we're constantly messing things up. And then the key is to be open and honest and earnest enough to address it. And that's just on a day-to-day basis all the way through every day. I mean, we draw stuff about to put it out, look at it and go, then no, this isn't working. And we then react and change to it. So in a sense, everyone's failing all the time. Maybe I'm framing your question as catastrophic failure. No, life is just a series of small failures that you seek to mitigate. I went to this talk with Roger Madeline from Argent, and he was talking about failure, and he was talking about how we need to be allowed to fail more. But while I was listening to him, all I could think was it's very difficult to find a scenario where we're allowed to do anything differently or allowed to test things that have not been done before. And local authorities and planning requirements set out the way that we have to do everything to such a huge extent that we don't have the opportunity to try things to fail. And I think there's a real opportunity there. I think there's an opportunity to create, for example, one of my things that I think about is creating a planning use called Exemplar, where what we do is we say, okay, let's put all of our planning standards in a box and look at development in terms of being a series of qualities or values based. And we would set those values very high: exemplary architecture, exemplary sustainability, 50-50, affordable private, all of these things. And then what we could do is we could have window to window distances that were closer than the standard says it should be, and all of those kind of things. And if those little examples and little exemplars are good, I mean, I live in one myself. I live in a 1952 housing scheme that was designed by Walter Siegel, who was a pre-war emigre from Eastern Europe, and they brought a lot of socialist values to the building of housing. If you try to apply for planning permission for that today, you would not get it because the windows are too close to one another. The cars are all parked somewhere else. The rubbish is all centralized. There's one communal garden. No one's got private garden. All of these things are wonderful. I feel that we need to roll back the system a little bit to allow people to fail in a kind of controlled way and to test more, to test things that perhaps our standards haven't maybe got right.
We're going to talk about design in just a moment, but before that, a brief message. Powered by Mix Interiors, Mix Awards is the most important awards program for commercial interior design and architecture, celebrating the most groundbreaking projects, the most inventive products, and the people behind them. For more information on Mix Awards and Mix Awards North, the biggest nights in the design calendar, visit mixinteriors.com. So, it's not all that you do, of course, but dMFK has won particular praise for its work with heritage buildings, breathing new life into spaces and places with long histories. Why is that a particular passion for you? Why does it matter?
I think before this whole preoccupation with retrofit, we were always restoring old buildings. And my principal reason why is because I love them. My entire childhood was being dragged around building sites and understanding the way things go together. And so as my practice started, like I said before, we started restoring a lot of these old factories and actually particularly schools. They were LCC 19th century schools into residential. I just found working in and around those buildings just exhilarating. And that's an area that we've always continued to work on. So we've got 25 years worth of back catalogue of mostly restorations. And I think it all comes back down to what I said before about my dad and the sledgehammer, that 1 minute you would perceive a space one way, and then you take a hammer to a wall and you suddenly perceive it in a completely different way. And I really, really enjoy that because it's central to the evolution of buildings. And I get very frustrated when people take heritage to be too precious, because I think buildings should and can evolve. And I think we need to always be looking at them with fresh eyes and not be looking at them as preserved an aspect. In fact, I was with a client the other day who had bought 2 flats that were designed by a very, very famous British modernist architect. They're grade 2 star listed, and he had gone to the heritage officer and they said, no, we can't combine them. And then he found an old document that was Dennis Lasdon had written and said, actually, our lives are very flexible and these flats are designed to be knocked around and recombined. And you gave that to the officer and they said, okay, but the default position that you can't change buildings is problematic. I'm most excited by subverting and changing existing things.
Why do you think we are so reverential about historic architecture? This idea that actually, things can't be changed. They can't adapt. And, inevitably that can sometimes lead to a situation where we're all in cities living in something akin to a museum.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally, in my opinion, it comes down to a lack of confidence in the way we all communicate about the essence of what architecture and design is. I think that a lot of people can judge architecture by surface. So they say, well, that's a beautiful cornice, or that's a lovely colour brick, or whatever. But actually, architecture is a lot more than those things, isn't it? It's the way the light falls on a building, the quality of the space, the proportions of the space. And actually, when you start to think about architecture in more dimensions than just materiality, and there's politics and all sorts of and geography and demography and all those things come into this complicated equation, you could then be able to place a modernist building next to a classical building and compare them. The light falls across them in this same way. The space's proportion is kind of similar. And obviously people like the famous modernists like Corbusier and Louis Kahn, who Moshe Safdie worked for, all spoke in those terms. They were inspired by antiquity. So I think there's a big job to be done in schools and sort of in further education to sort of help people to communicate, to find a common language to discuss architecture. And I think when they do that, then that would lessen the preoccupation with surface and sort of the keeping of material quality. And that's not to say we don't have beautiful bits of heritage that are there to be kept. But if they need to change to be better, I think that we need to help people to be more confident. And I think in local authority, and actually less so at historic England and places like, there's a lot of very sort of smart people who are thinking about buildings evolutions and the enabling effect of development on heritage. For example, if you've got an old building that's beautiful, but you can't actually use it because there's so much restriction that you can't change its use, that building will crumble. If that building is given a new use and there's latitude given to it turning a profit, it being more sustainable, its fabric being better performing, then that building will it will generate income and it will pay for its refurbishment, which, I mean, we did the Salters Hall, which was a Basil Spence building from 1976. We added 50% onto the lettable area of that building without messing it up. And that paid for its restoration. And now it's won several awards and people go on tours around it. And I'm very proud of that. But so it's a very complicated question, heritage. And I think also post-war Britain was scarred by the bad interpretation of some of the principles of modernism, or just by cheap, bad architecture. And we lost a lot of good buildings. So that makes people more obsessed with keeping certain buildings. And also, I think a lot of those bad buildings created an enormous amount of mistrust of architects and of modernism generally, which they perceived to be dark and dull and grey. And some of it was. And some of it's fabulous. Neoclassical architecture is also grey. It doesn't make it an all grey, like the British Museum is all grey. It doesn't make it bad. It's just there are good buildings and bad buildings. But it's like anything, isn't it? It's like music. You look back at a period of music, whether, when we were all in the 80s, everybody said, this music's terrible. And then we edit out, forget the things that weren't good, and we remember the things that were good. And that's the same with architecture, in my opinion.
I will not have a bad word said about 80s.
I could give you some. Probably the band I played in.
Well, in your language then, talk me through your design ethos, the pillars of dMFK's design approach.
There's something going on at the moment, a sort of obsession with quantitative standards. So let's say if you take, say, the BCO standards, which obviously took offices from a very poor place, brought them to a sort of standardized quality place. But in doing that, we always have to have a mind to, if everything is to the same quantity, so like level on a desktop is 500 lux and all of these kind of things, then everything will look the same. And what we're looking for at the moment is distinctiveness and difference, which means that the lux level on the desktop does not have to be 500 lux and the ceiling height does not have to be 2.8 or whatever it is. You can have one room that's 2 meters and next to it have one that's 5 meters, and that creates excitement and exhilaration. So they're very hard things to quantify. And that occurs in housing as well. People ask you at parties, why do all new housing look the same? And it's starting to look the same because of these quantitative standards that we're all having to follow. Windows must be 18 meters minimum apart. Car must be able to get to here. And there's a million little standards that mean that everything looks the same with wall to window ratios. So as a practice, I like to focus on qualitative issues, which are harder to pot and harder to write down, but nonetheless, a sense of community, a sense of distinctiveness, a contrast in lights, contrasts in acoustics. All of these things are much, much looser, but they're the things that start to sort of create joy. So as a practice, we're really always focusing on qualitative approach to architecture rather than a quantitative one. And that's not to do down any of these quantitative standards. They're for very good reason. But I think that if we all design to quantitative standards, then we'll all end up designing things that look the same, and the market won't have that. The market wants something that surprises them.
Can you give me a project, for example, that has been perhaps surprising or that embodies some of those particular dMFK principles, something you're proud of?
The one I mentioned earlier, Chancery House, is a big building. It was 170,000 square foot, probably one of the biggest flex workspaces in London. And all of the other bidders who went for that building, and we saw quite a lot of the other bids before the Office Group bought it, all based their financial appraisals on adding extra space to the building. And whilst obviously we do that, we didn't on that building. All we did was we looked at the quality of the space that we found. So It's about sweating that building really, really hard, making sure that every inch of the building found itself a use. So there are spaces that are 2 meters high, and that's where we've put various parts of the gyms and saunas and all sorts of things, little kind of rooms that have a different character. So things like neurodiversity, for example, you don't have to just have a room that says the neurodiversity sensory room. You can just take a part of the building which is more intimate and softer and more quiet and hidden away, like the one I'm in now, actually, and make that a really beautiful library. And we've gone around that building and tried to maximize every single part of the building and make it the best version of what it can be. And I think it's a really good display of not working to quantitative standards, working to quality, and not discounting things that are traditionally perceived to be not valuable. So for us, the knottier the problem, the harder the building, the more tricky it is, the more unusable a space, actually bear the places where you might experience the biggest delta between what you find and what you make.
But a lot of the points that you were making previously do sound quite practical. And then you talked about, in the previous example, putting in a beautiful library. And that notion of beautiful spaces is actually something that I really associate with dMFK. I find your work to be beautiful. So beyond those practical elements, why does beauty matter, and how do you build that beauty into your work?
It's a really great word, beauty, because we all know people who are beautiful looking but are not very beautiful people. And we all know people who are much to look at, who are absolutely the most beautiful people we've ever met. And I think that applies to buildings too. I think that we have a certain visual way of doing things, which is based on, if you're talking about workspace specifically, we want to make workspaces that sail the line between informality and professionalism. And that implies certain kinds of finishes, and they want to be acoustically soft, and proportions need to be right, and they need to be comfortable and human centric. And when you pile all those things together, things tend to be beautiful. That doesn't mean to say everything needs to be done in oak or metal. It makes no difference. Actually, it's just getting the combination of all of those different elements right. That creates beauty, in my opinion. It comprises a lot more things than surfaces, as I've sort of said when we're talking about heritage, for example.
Well, we've gathered that heritage aspect is, of course, absolutely central to dMFK's work. There is a layering on top of what's come before. So what do you want your legacy to be?
Look, I'm 56. I don't know how many more years I want to be doing this for. We are building the practice and building a team here. We're now 56 people, and trying to educate those people and teach those people about how we think you should be approaching restoring buildings and handing over the reins to those people in a way. So one of the things that's really important to be at the moment is creating a culture in the office that means that people stay. That means that people understand the way we think you should approach buildings, which is a human-centric approach to design, and that continues into the future, and that they all kind of take that on. So building our headquarters here. So again, I've got very, very strong feelings about workspace and culture in businesses, partly because we're workspace architects, but I also, in my heart, know that when we're all together, and when we're designing together, and when we're in the same space, and we're socializing, and we're doing all these other things, and we're trying to use the design of our office to facilitate a culture, that's when we do our best work. And I want to get that message out into the workspace as well, because we all bought into this, frankly, bullshit version of workspace where we all work remotely. So I'm trying to value physical space, value physical connection, and marry that all up into design that gets people to come to the office by attracting them there by good design. So that's really what we're trying to build here.
Well, it's been a really interesting conversation, Julian. I think my top takeaways are twofold. Firstly, that heritage isn't something we should be overly precious about. Design, our built environments, they need to evolve to remain purposeful and relevant for today. And I also really love this idea that maybe everything doesn't happen for a reason, but sometimes the things that come are better than the things we lost. I think that's a really optimistic note. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Things I've Learned. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you like and subscribe, and of course, tell your friends about it. You can catch up with Season 1 wherever you're listening to this, and there are some really interesting insights there, from Iris Dunbar's advice for the next generation of designer to Google's Ali Aslami on what the rise of AI means for human creativity. We also film these conversations, so if you want to see us as well as hear us, head over to our website, mixinteriors.com, or find us on YouTube. Join me next time when I'll be speaking to We Want More's Ruud Belmans. Things I've Learned is hosted by me, Harry McKinley. This episode was produced by Nada Smiljanic, and the executive producer was Dan Jackson, with original music by Memotone. Things I've Learned is a co-production by Reduced Listening and Mix Interiors.